In my hand, I'm holding the very paper that introduced the heavily criticized Waterfall method for software project management. And you know what it says? That Waterfall is a bad idea. It was never a waterfall. On the second page of the paper, he introduces the model which is now known as Waterfall. He didn't call it Waterfall, but that's what it is. These days, the names of the phases aren't exactly the same, but that's besides the point. The gist is the same. Following the Waterfall method, a software project should be run like this. We start by gathering requirements. We then move on to analyze the requirements, and we then design the program. And then we move on to coding the actual program. Then we move on to testing the actual program, and only then do we deploy and enter the phase of maintenance. It's linear. We start up here and we move downwards here, like a waterfall. Notice how the arrows only move in this direction, forwards and never backwards. But in the paper, Winston argues that the point of this structure is to maximize the amount of early work that is salvageable. That means we're trying to avoid doing things that will later become waste, things that we will have to trash and then redo. The paper then goes on to argue that underlying this idea is the assumption that in the usual case, we will only ever have to go back a single step, a single phase, like this, and that it's very rare for us to have to go back multiple steps. So we would not see cases where from maintenance, we would have to go all the way back into program design. And that is how we would then maximize the amount of salvageable work. Because the idea is then that when you discover a problem in testing, you only have to go back to coding and fix it. And when you discover a problem in coding, you only have to go back to program design and fix it, because every step is done very thoroughly. However, in the paper, on the line that is literally below the figure, we can read this: I believe in this concept, but the implementation described above is risky and invites failure. Risky and invites failure? Does that sound like he's trying to argue that Waterfall is a good idea? Not at all, right? His argument for why it's risky is that the testing phase that comes here in the very, very end, the testing phase is the first phase where we actually experience the system rather than analyze it. And there's a plethora of problems, a number of categories of problems that only ever can be discovered when we experience the system rather than when we analyze it. So there are many problems that we only can discover here, but that we can't discover here. And these problems fundamentally will not only throw us back one step back into coding, but rather will throw us back to program design, or perhaps even all the way back to requirements. So this idea of maximizing the amount of salvageable work on the basis of only having to move back one step at a time, Winston is arguing fundamentally is a lie. Here's what he writes. In effect, the development process has returned to the origin, and one can expect a 100% overrun in schedule and or costs, because we have to redo the whole thing again. So the very paper that introduced the Waterfall method is well aware that Waterfall simply doesn't work. For many types of projects, you simply cannot just walk in a straight line. In the end of the paper, he writes that the simpler method has never worked on large software development efforts, and the costs to recover far exceed those required to finance what his actual suggestion is. So what was his actual suggestion? Well, that's where this story sort of takes a bad turn, and I'd argue that his actual suggestion hasn't aged very well. In summary, his recommendations are that 1. You should make a preliminary design before the analysis phase. 2. That you should create even more design documents, and he has very specific recommendations. 3. That you in effect should run the whole process twice. 4. That you should do much more thorough testing, and again he has very specific recommendations. And 5, that you should involve the customer early in the process. So yeah, this paper doesn't really suggest iterative development, because it doesn't suggest that we draw a line from operations all the way back to the start. And the paper doesn't say that we should continue this loop until the customer is happy, which in a nutshell sort of would be the premise of iterative methods. We run the whole thing many times until the customer is happy. So that's not what the paper says. Instead, the paper proposes that after the requirements phase, we should do a preliminary design. We should then follow that with analysis, then follow that with an actual design, then follow that with writing the code, then doing all the testing, and then actually using the application. So using it with the customer. And then from there, we should go back to whatever phase, starting from analysis down to operations, that we deem sensible given from what we've learned here when we've used the system for the first time. So we would go back here to analysis, to design, to coding, to testing, or to operations. And here you can see this idea of running the whole thing twice. You start the initial lab, you shoot off into a sort of prototype lab where you're simply running the same steps as you would do in the main lab, and then when you're done with this sort of prototype lab, you shoot back into the main lab and finish up the main lab. So it's not really about iteration, but it's about doing the whole thing twice. Is that better? Probably. Is it excellent? Probably not. So now what? Can we conclude that the industry was well aware of the value of iterative development when the first Waterfall paper was published? No. I don't think so. But I certainly think we can conclude that the industry was well aware of the futility of trying to use a simple waterfall model where you assume that you will only ever have to go back one step at a time. That much is very clear from this paper. So the way we often portray waterfall today is not at all the way waterfall was actually presented in the original paper. That's it for today's history lesson, I guess. Subscribe.